N.I. Bukharin and E. Preobrazhensky, The ABC of Communism. Introduction. Our program. 1. What is a program? Every party pursues definite aims, whether it be a party of landowners or capitalists, on the one hand, or a party of workers or peasants, on the other. Every party must have definite aims, for otherwise it is not a party. If it be a party representing the interests of landowners, it will pursue the aims of landowners. It will endeavor to tighten the grasp of the owners upon the soil, to hold the peasants in bondage, to secure a high price for the produce of the landowners' estates, to hire labor cheaply, to rack rent the farms. If it be a party of capitalists and factory owners, it will likewise have its own aims, to procure cheap labor, to keep the workers well in hand, to find customers to toil harder, but, above all, so to arrange matters that the workers will have no tendency to allow their thoughts to turn towards ideas of a new social order. Let the workers think that there always have been masters and always will be masters. Such are the aims of the factory owners. It is self-evident that the workers and peasants will have utterly different aims from these, seeing that their interests are utterly different from those of the capitalists and landowners. People used to say, "What is wholesome for a Russian is death to a German." It would, in fact, be more accurate to say, "What is wholesome for a worker is death to a landowner or capitalist." That is to say, the worker has certain things to do, the capitalist other things, and the landowner yet others. Not every landowner, however, thinks out logically what is the best way of getting the last farthing out of the peasants. Many landowners are drunk most of the time, and do not even trouble to consider their bailiff's reports. The same thing happens in the case of the peasants and of the workers. There are some who say, "Oh, well, we shall get along somehow, why bother? We shall go on living as our fathers have always lived." Such persons never achieve anything, and do not even understand their own interests. On the other hand, those who realize how they can best defend their own interests, organize themselves into a party. Of course, the class as a whole does not enter the party, which is composed of the best and most energetic members of the class. Thus those who enter the party lead the rest. To the Workers' Party, the party of Communist Bolsheviks, adhere the best of the workers and poor. Among the means of spiritual subjugation at the disposal of the capitalist state, 3 deserve a special mention: the state school, the state church, and the state, or state-supported, press. The bourgeoisie is well aware that it cannot control the working masses by the use of force alone. It is necessary that the workers' brains should be completely enmeshed as if in a spider's web. The bourgeois state looks upon the workers as working cattle. These beasts must labor, but they must not bite. Consequently, they must not merely be whipped or shot when they attempt to bite, but they must be trained and tamed, just as wild beasts in a menagerie are trained by beast tamers. Similarly, the capitalist state maintains specialists to stupefy and subdue the proletariat. It maintains bourgeois teachers and professors, the clergy, bourgeois authors and journalists. In the state schools, these specialists teach children from their earliest years to obey capital and to despise and hate rebels. The children's heads are stuffed with fables about the revolution and the revolutionary movement. Emperors, kings, and industrial magnates are glorified. In the churches, the priests, who are salaried by the state, preach that all authority comes from God. Day after day, the bourgeois newspapers trumpet these lies, whilst working-class papers are in most cases suppressed by the capitalist state. Under such conditions, is it easy for the workers to extract themselves from the quagmire? A German imperialist bandit wrote, "We do not only need the soldiers' legs, but also their brains and their hearts." The bourgeois state, in like manner, aims at educating the workers so that they may resemble domestic animals who will work like horses, and eat humble pie. In this manner the capitalist system ensures its own development. The machine of exploitation does its work. Surplus value is continually extracted from the working class. The capitalist state stands on guard, and takes good care that there shall be no uprising of the wage slaves. 13 Fundamental contradictions of the capitalist system. We must now examine whether capitalist or bourgeois society is well or ill constructed. Anything is sound and good when the mutual adaptation of its parts is entirely satisfactory. Let us consider the mechanism of a clock. It works accurately and freely if all the cogwheels are properly adjusted one to another. Let us now look at capitalist society. We can perceive without difficulty that capitalist society is far less soundly constructed than it appears to be at the first glance. On the contrary, it exhibits grave contradictions and disastrous flaws. In the first place, under capitalism the production and distribution of goods is quite unorganized. Anarchy of production prevails. What does this mean? It means that all the capitalist entrepreneurs, or capitalist companies, produce commodities independently of one another. Instead of society undertaking to reckon up what it needs and how much of each article, the factory owners simply produce upon the calculation of what will bring them most profit, and will best enable them to defeat their rivals in the market. The consequence often is that commodities are produced in excessive quantities. We are talking, of course, of pre-war days. There is then no sale for them. The workers cannot buy them, for they have not enough money. Thereupon a crisis ensues. The factories are shut down, and the workers are turned out into the street. Furthermore, the anarchy of production entails a struggle for the market. Each producer wants to entice away the other's customers, to corner the market. This struggle assumes various forms. It begins with the competition between two factory owners. It ends in the World War, wherein the capitalist states wrestle with one another for the world market. This signifies not merely that the parts of capitalist society interfere with one another's working, but that there is a direct conflict between the constituent parts. The first reason, therefore, for the disharmony of capitalist society is the anarchy of production, which leads to crises, internecine competition, and wars. The second reason for the disharmony of capitalist society is to be found in the class structure of that society. Considered in its essence, capitalist society is not one society but two societies. It consists of capitalists, on the one hand, and of workers and poor peasants, on the other. Between these two classes there is continuous and irreconcilable enmity. This is what we speak of as the class war. Here, also, we see that the various parts of capitalist society are not merely ill-adapted to one another, but are actually in unceasing conflict. Is capitalism going to collapse, or is it not? The answer to the question depends upon the following considerations. If we study the evolution of capitalism, if we examine the changes it has undergone in the course of time, and if we perceive that its disharmonies are diminishing, then we can confidently wish it a long life. If, on the other hand, we discover that in the course of time the various parts of the capitalist machine have come to clash with one another more and more violently, if we discern that the flaws in the structure are becoming positive chasms, then it is time to say, rest in peace. We have now, therefore, to study the evolution of capitalism. Chapter 2: The Development of the Capitalistic Social Order. 14. The struggle between small-scale and large-scale production, between working ownership and capitalistic non-working ownership. The struggle between small-scale and large-scale capital and manufacturing industry. Huge factories, sometimes employing more than 10,000 workers, and having enormous machines, did not always exist. They appeared by degrees, growing up upon the remnants of artisan production and small-scale industry when these were undergoing ruin. In order to understand why this came about, we must first of all take into account the circumstance that, under private property and commodity production, a struggle for buyers, competition, is inevitable. Who is the winner in this struggle? He is the winner who knows how to attract buyers to himself and to wrest them from his competitors. Now the chief means for the attraction of buyers is to offer commodities for sale at a lower price. Who can sell at a very low price? This is the first question we have to answer. It is obvious that the large-scale producer can sell more cheaply than the small-scale producer or the independent artisan, for the large-scale producer can buy more cheaply. Large-scale production has in this respect many advantages. Above all, large-scale production has this advantage, that the entrepreneur who commands much capital can install better machinery, and can procure better tools and apparatus generally. The independent artisan or the small master finds it very difficult to get along. He cannot usually command a power plant. He dares not think of installing better and larger machines. He has not the wherewithal to buy them. Nor is the small capitalist able to procure the newest machines. Consequently, the larger the undertaking, the more perfect is the technique, the more economical is the labor, and the lower is the cost of production. In the large factories of the United States and Germany there are actually scientific laboratories where new and improved methods are continually being discovered. Thus science is wedded to industry. The discoveries made in such a laboratory remain secrets of the enterprise to which it is attached, and bring profit to that enterprise alone. In small-scale production and hand production, one and the same worker conducts nearly all the stages of production. In machine production, on the other hand, where numerous workers are employed, one worker is responsible for one stage only, a second worker for a second stage, a third for a third, and so on. In this way, under the system known as the division of labor, the work goes much quicker. How great is the advantage of this system was made manifest by some American researches instituted in the year 1898. Here are the results. The manufacture of 10 plows. By hand labor, 2 workers, performing 11 distinct operations, worked in all 1,180 hours, and received $54. By machine labor, 52 workers, performing 97 operations, the more numerous the workers, the more varied the operations, worked in all 37 hours and 28 minutes, and received $7.90. We see that the time was enormously less and that the cost of labor was very much lower. The manufacture of 100 sets of clock wheels. By hand labor, 14 workers, 453 operations, 341,866 hours, $80.82. By machine labor, 10 workers, 1,088 operations, 8,343 hours, $1.80. The manufacture of 500 yards of cloth. Hand labor, 3 workers, 19 operations, 7,534 hours, $135.60. Machine labor, 252 workers, 43 operations, 84 hours, $6.81. Many similar examples might be given. Furthermore, small manufacturers and hand workers are quite unable to undertake those branches of production for which a highly developed mechanical technique is essential. For instance, the manufacture of locomotive engines and ironclads, coal mining, and so on. Large-scale production affects economies in every direction, in buildings, machinery, raw materials, lighting and heating, cost of labor, utilization of waste products, etc. In fact, let us suppose that there are 1,000 small workshops, and that there is one large factory which produces the same quantity of commodities as all the little workshops put together. It is much easier to build one large factory than 1,000 small workshops. The raw materials for the workshops will be used far more wastefully. Lighting and heating will be much easier in the case of the large factory. The factory will have the advantage in the matter of general supervision, cleaning up, repairs, etc. In a word, there will unquestionably be in all respects an economy, a saving, in running the large factory. In the purchase of raw materials and of all that is necessary for production, large-scale capital is likewise at an advantage. The wholesale buyer buys more cheaply, and the goods are of better quality. Furthermore, the great factory owner is better acquainted with the market, knows better where to buy cheaply. In like manner, the small enterprise is always at a disadvantage when entering the market as seller. Not only does the large-scale producer know better where to buy cheaply, for this purpose, he has travelers. He conducts his business in the exchange, where news concerning various commodities is always coming in. He has commercial ties extending almost all over the world. In addition, he can afford to wait. If, for instance, the price of his product is too low, he can retain it in his warehouses, pending a rise in prices. The small producer cannot do this. he lives from hand to mouth. As soon as he has sold his product, he begins to use for immediate expenses the money he has received. He has no margin. For this reason he is forced to sell willy-nilly, for otherwise he will starve to death. It is obvious that this is a great disadvantage to him. It need hardly be said that large-scale production enjoys an additional advantage in the matter of credit. If a great entrepreneur has urgent need of money, he can get it. Banks will always lend money to a solid firm at a comparatively low rate of interest. But hardly anyone will give credit to the small producer. If he can borrow at all, exorbitant interest will be demanded. Thus the small producer easily falls into the hands of the usurer. All these advantages attaching to large-scale enterprise explain why small-scale production must invariably succumb in capitalist society. Large-scale capital crushes the small producer, takes away his customers, and ruins him, so that he drops into the ranks of the proletariat or becomes a tramp. In many cases, of course, the small master continues to cling to life. He fights desperately, puts his own hand to the work, forces his workers and his family to labor with all their strength, but in the end he is compelled to give up his place to the great capitalist. In many instances, one who seems to be an independent master is in truth entirely dependent on large-scale capital, works for it, and cannot take a single step without its permission. The small producer is frequently in the toils of the moneylender. Ostensibly independent, he really works for this spider. Or he is a dependent of the purchaser of his commodities. In other cases he is a dependent of the shop for which he works. In the last instance, though apparently independent, he has really become a wage worker in the service of the capitalist who owns the large shop. It may happen that the capitalist provides him with raw materials, and sometimes with tools as well. In Russia, many of those engaged in home industry are in this position. In such cases, it is perfectly clear that the home worker has become a satellite of capital. Another form of subordination to capital is that in which small repairing workshops are grouped around a large undertaking, so that they are, as it were, mere screws in the wall of the big building. Their independence is only apparent. We sometimes see that small masters, independent artisans, home workers, traders, or petty capitalists, when they have been driven out of one branch of manufacture or commerce, enter some other branch in which large-scale capital is less powerful. In many cases, persons who have been ruined in this way become small traders, peddlers, and the like. Thus large-scale capital tends, step by step, to replace small production everywhere. Huge enterprises come into existence, each employing thousands or tens of thousands of workers. Large-scale capital is becoming the ruler of the world. The working owner is disappearing. His place is being taken by large-scale capital. As examples of the decline of small-scale production in Russia, let us consider the home workers. Some of these, such as furriers and basket weavers, worked with their own raw materials and sold to anyone who would buy. In course of time, the home worker began to work for one particular capitalist. This is what happened in the case of the Moscow hat makers, toy makers, brush makers, etc. In the next stage, home workers procure the raw materials from their own employer, and thus pass into bondage to him, e.g. the locksmiths of Pavlovsk and of Bermekino. Finally, the home worker is paid by his employer at piecework rates, the nail makers of Tver, the boot makers of Kimry, the mat makers of Makarev, the knife forgers of Pavlovo. The handloom weavers have been similarly enslaved. In England, the expiring system of small-scale production was nicknamed the sweating system, owing to the abominable conditions that prevailed. In Germany, during the period 1882 to 1895, the number of small enterprises diminished by 8.6%. The number of middle-sized enterprises, those employing from 6 to 50 workers, increased by 64.1%, and the number of great enterprises increased by 90%. Since 1895, a notable number of middle-sized enterprises have also been crushed out. In Russia, the victory of the factory system over home industry has been fairly rapid. The textile industry, weaving, is one of the most important branches of manufacture in Russia. If we consider the changes that have taken place in the cotton industry, if we compare the number of factory workers with the number of home workers, we are able to judge how rapidly the factory system is displacing home industry. Here are the figures. Year 1866 number of factory workers 94,566, number of home workers 66,178. Year 1879 number of factory workers 162,691, number of home workers 50,152. Year 1994 to 95 number of factory workers 242,051, number of home workers 20,475. In the year 1866, for every 100 workers engaged as weavers in cotton factories, there were 70 weavers working at home. In the years 1894 to 5, for every 100 factory workers there were only 8 home workers. In Russia, the growth of large-scale production was extraordinarily rapid because foreign capital undertook its direct organization. By the year 1902, large enterprises were already employing nearly half, 40%, of all the Russian industrial workers. In 1903, in European Russia, the factories employing more than 100 workers numbered 17% of all factories and workshops, and of the total number of workers engaged in factories and workshops, 76.7% worked in these large factories. The victory of large-scale production all over the world entails much suffering for small producers. Sometimes whole occupations perish and entire districts are depopulated, e.g. the Silesian weavers in Germany, the Indian weavers, etc. b. The struggle between small-scale and large-scale capital in agriculture. The same struggle between small-scale and large-scale production which is carried on in industry occurs also under capitalism in agriculture. The landlord, who administers his estate just as the capitalist administers his factory, the rich peasant, grasping and usurious, the middle peasant, the poor peasant, who often accepts a job from the landlord or the rich peasant, and the agricultural laborer. We may compare this agricultural series with the industrial series of great capitalist, small capitalist, independent artisan, home worker, wage worker. In the country, as in the town, extensive possessions give an advantage when compared with small. On a large farm, it is comparatively easy to introduce up-to-date methods. Agricultural machinery, electric or steam plows, harvesters, cutters and binders, drillers, threshers, steam threshers, etc., is almost beyond the reach of the small farmer. The independent artisan cannot think of installing expensive machinery in his little workshop. He has no money to pay for it, nor could he turn such machinery to good account even if he could buy it. In like manner, the peasant cannot buy a steam plow, for, if he had the money, a steam plow would be of no use to him. A great machine like this, for its profitable utilization, needs a large area of land. It is valueless on a patch where there is hardly room for a fowl run. The efficient utilization of machinery and tools depends on the area of land under cultivation. For the full utilization of a horse plow we need 30 hectares of land. For that of a set comprising driller, harvester, and thresher, about 70 hectares. For a steam thresher, about 250 hectares. For a steam plow, about 1,000 hectares. Recently, machines driven by electric power have been used in agriculture. For these, also, large-scale farming is indispensable. As a rule, only for farming on the large scale is it practicable to undertake irrigation, to drain swamps, to provide field drainage, the laying of earthenware pipes in the fields to carry off superfluous water, to build light railways, and so on. In agriculture, just as in manufacturing industry, where work is done on a large scale, we save upon tools and machinery, materials, labor power, fuel, lighting, etc. In large-scale farming, there will be per deciatina less waste space between the fields, fewer hedges, ditches, and fences. Less seed will be lost in these waste areas. Furthermore, the owner of a large farm finds it worthwhile to engage expert agriculturists, and he can work his land by thoroughly scientific methods. In matters of trade and credit, what applies to industry applies also to agriculture. The large-scale farmer is better acquainted with the market. he can await favorable opportunities, he can buy all he needs more cheaply, can sell at a better price. Only one thing remains for the small competitor: he struggles with all his might. Small-scale agriculture is able to continue in existence only through strenuous labor, in conjunction with the restriction of needs, with semi-starvation. Thus alone can it maintain itself under the capitalist copyright game. It suffers still more severely owing to heavy taxation. The capitalist state lays crushing burdens upon the smallholder. It suffices to remember what Tsarist taxation signified to the peasants: sell all you have, so long as you pay your taxes. In general, it may be said that small-scale production is far more tenacious of life in agriculture than in manufacturing industry. In the towns, the independent artisans and other small-scale producers are for the most part rapidly undergoing ruin, but in the rural districts of all countries peasant farming still leads a tolerably sturdy existence. Nevertheless, in the country, too, the impoverishment of the majority proceeds apace, only here the results are less obvious than in the towns. Sometimes it seems, as far as the amount of land is concerned, that an agricultural enterprise is very small, when in reality it is quite an extensive affair, because much capital has been put into it, and because it employs a considerable number of workers. This applies, for instance, to market gardens in the neighborhood of large towns. Sometimes, on the other hand, those who seem to be independent smallholders are really for the most part wage workers. Sometimes they are employed on neighboring farms, sometimes they engage in seasonal occupations elsewhere, and sometimes they work in the towns. What is happening to the independent artisans and to the home workers is in like manner happening to the peasants of all lands. A few of them become kulaks, liquor sellers, usurers, rich peasants who by degrees round off their possessions. Some of them manage to struggle on as they are. The remainder are ultimately ruined. They sell their cow and their nag, becoming horseless men. Finally, the plot of land goes the way of the rest. The man will either settle in the town or make his living as an agricultural laborer. The horseless man becomes a wage worker, whereas the kulak, the rich peasant who hires workers, becomes a landlord or a capitalist. Thus in agriculture a vast quantity of land, tools, machines, cattle, horses, etc., passes into the hands of a small group of capitalist landlords, for whom millions of workers labor, and upon whom millions of peasants are dependent. In the United States, where the capitalist system has developed more fully than elsewhere, there are great estates which are worked like factories. And just as, in factories, only one product is turned out, so it happens on these farms. There may be huge fields where nothing but strawberries are grown, or gigantic orchards, enormous poultry farms, colossal wheat fields, worked by machinery. Many branches of agricultural production are concentrated in a few hands. In this way, for example, there comes to exist a chicken king, a capitalist into whose hands is concentrated, more or less completely, the rearing of chickens, an egg king, and so on. 15. The dependent position of the proletariat, the reserve army of labor, women's labor and child labor. Under capitalism, the masses of the population are to an increasing extent transformed into wage workers. Ruined artisans, home workers, peasants, traders, minor capitalists, in a word, all who have been thrown overboard, who have been driven down by large-scale capital, fall into the ranks of the proletariat. The more that wealth undergoes concentration and passes into the hands of a small group of capitalists, the more do the masses of the people become the wage slaves of these capitalists. Owing to the continuous decay of the middle strata and classes, the number of the workers always exceeds the requirements of capital. For this reason, the workers are bound hand and foot by capitalism. The worker must work for the capitalist. If he refuses, the employer can find 100 others to take his place. But this dependence upon capital has another cause besides the ruin of new and ever-new strata of the population. The dominion of capital over the workers is further strengthened by the way in which the capitalist is continually turning superfluous workers into the street, and making of them a reserve of labor power. How does this come about? As follows. We have already seen that every factory owner endeavors to reduce the cost of production. This is why he is continually installing new machinery. But the machine commonly replaces labor, renders part of the workers superfluous. The introduction of new machinery signifies that some of the workers will be discharged. Among those hitherto employed in the factory, a certain number will be thrown out of work. Since, however, new machinery is perpetually being introduced in one branch of production or another, it is clear that unemployment must always exist under capitalism. For the capitalist is not concerned to provide work for all, or to supply goods to everyone. His aim is to secure increasing profit. Obviously, therefore, he will discharge any workers who are unable to produce for him as much profit as before. In actual fact, we see in all capitalist countries a huge number of unemployed workers in every large city. Among the ranks of these unemployed we find Chinese and Japanese workers, ruined peasants who have come from the ends of the earth in search of work. We find lads fresh from the country, ex-shopkeepers, and ex-artisans. We find also metal workers, printers, textile workers, and the like, men who have worked in factories for years, and have then been thrown out of employment owing to the introduction of new machinery. They all combine to form a reserve supply of labor power for capital, to form what Marx termed the reserve army of labor. Owing to the existence of this reserve army of labor, owing to perennial unemployment, the dependence and subjection of the working class continually increase. With the aid of new machinery, capital is able to extract more gold from some of the workers, while the others, the superfluous workers, are thrown into the street. But those who have been thrown into the street constitute a scourge in the hands of the capitalist, a whip which he uses to keep in order those who remain in employment. The industrial reserve army gives examples of complete brutalization, destitution, starvation, death, and even crime. Those who are out of work for years gradually take to drink, become loafers, tramps, beggars, etc. In great cities London, New York, Hamburg, Berlin, Paris, there are whole quarters inhabited by these out-of-works. As far as Moscow is concerned, Hitrov Market furnishes a similar example. Here, we no longer find the proletariat, but a new stratum, consisting of those who have forgotten how to work. This product of capitalist society is known as the lumpen proletariat, loafer proletariat. The introduction of machinery also led to the employment of women's labor and child labor, which are cheaper, and are therefore more profitable to the capitalist. In earlier days, before the introduction of machinery, special skill was requisite for the work of production, and sometimes a long term of apprenticeship was indispensable. Some machines can be managed by children. All that is necessary is to move the arm or the leg until fatigue becomes overpowering. This is why, after the invention of machinery, the labor of women and children came to be more widely used. Women and children offer less resistance than male workers to capitalist oppression. They are more submissive, more easily intimidated. They are more ready to believe the priest and to accept everything they are told by persons in authority. Hence the factory owner often replaces male workers by females, and compels little children to transmute their blood for him into the golden coins of profit. In the year 1913, the number of women workers of all kinds, i.e. not manual workers alone, was as follows: France, 6,800,000, Germany, 9,400,000, Austria-Hungary, 8,200,000, Italy, 5,700,000, Belgium, 930,000, USA, 8 million, England and Wales, 6 million. In Russia, the number of women workers continually increased. In 1900, the women workers numbered 25% of all factory workers. In 1908, they numbered 31%. In 1912, 45%. In some branches of production, the women outnumbered the men. For example, in the textile industry, out of 870,000 workers in the year 1912, 453,000 were women, more than half, over 52%. During the war, the number of women workers increased enormously. As regards child labor, this flourishes in many places, despite prohibitions. In countries of advanced capitalist development, as for instance in the USA, child labor is met with at every turn. This leads to the breakup of the working-class family. If the mothers, and very often the children as well, go to the factory, what becomes of family life? When a woman enters the factory, when she becomes a wage worker, she is from time to time exposed, just like a man, to all the hardships of unemployment. She, likewise, is shown the door by the capitalist. She, likewise, joins the ranks of the Industrial Reserve Army. She, just like a man, is liable to undergo moral degradation. Associated with this we have prostitution, when a woman sells herself to the first comer in the street. Nothing to eat, no work, hunted from everywhere, and even if she has work, the wages are so low that she may be compelled to supplement her earnings by the sale of her body. After a time, the new trade becomes habitual. Thus arises the caste of professional prostitutes. In big towns, prostitutes are found in very large numbers. In such cities as Hamburg and London, these unfortunates are reckoned by tens of thousands. Capital uses them as a source of profit and enrichment, organizing vast brothels on capitalistic lines. There is an extensive international commerce in white slaves. The towns of Argentina used to be the centers of this traffic. Especially repulsive is child prostitution, which flourishes in all European and American towns. In capitalist society, as better and better machinery is invented, as larger and larger factories are built, and as the quantity of commodities increases, there is a concomitant increase in capitalist oppression. The Industrial Reserve Army becomes more degraded and impoverished, and the working class grows more dependent upon its exploiters. If private ownership did not exist, if everything were cooperatively owned, a very different state of affairs would prevail. Then people would shorten the working day, would husband their strength, economize toil, enjoy ample leisure. When the capitalist introduces machinery, his concern is for profit. He does not think of reducing the working day, for he would only lose by this. The capitalist does not use machinery to emancipate people, but to enslave them. As capitalism develops, an ever-increasing proportion of capital is devoted to machinery, enormous buildings, huge furnaces, and so on. On the other hand, the proportion of capital expended upon the wages of labor grows continually smaller. In earlier days, when hand labor still prevailed, the expenditure upon looms and other gear was trifling. Nearly all the expenditure of capital was upon the wages of labor. Now, conversely, much the larger portion is devoted to buildings and machinery. The result is that the demand for working hands does not keep pace with the increase in the number of proletarians, does not suffice to absorb the influx of those who are ruined by capitalism. The more vigorous the advance of technique under capitalism, the more cruelly does capital oppress the working class, for it grows ever harder to find work, more and more difficult to live. 16. The anarchy of production, competition, crises. The miseries of the working class continually increase concomitantly with the progress of manufacturing technique. Under capitalism, this progress, instead of bringing advantages to all, brings increased profit to capital, but unemployment and ruin to many workers. There are, however, additional causes for the increasing misery. We have already learned that capitalist society is very badly constructed. Private ownership holds sway, and there is no definite plan whatever. Every factory owner conducts his business independently of the others. He struggles with his rivals for buyers, competes with them. The question now arises whether this struggle becomes enfeebled or intensified as capitalism develops. At first sight, it might seem that the struggle is enfeebled. In actual fact, the number of capitalists grows continually smaller. The great fish eat up the small fry. Whereas in earlier days 10,000 entrepreneurs were fighting one with another and competition was embittered, since now there are fewer competitors, it might be imagined that the rivalry would be less acute. But this is not so in reality. The very opposite is the case. It is true that there are fewer competitors. But each one of these has become enormously stronger than were the rivals of an earlier stage. The struggle between them is greater, not less, more violent, not more gentle. If in the whole world there should rule only a few capitalists, then these capitalist governments would fight with one another. This is what it has come to at long last. At the present time, the struggle goes on between immense combinations of capitalists, between their respective states. Moreover, they fight with one another, not solely by means of competitive prices, but also by means of armed force. Thus, it is only in respect of the number of competitors that competition can be said to diminish as capitalism develops. In other respects, it grows continually fiercer and more destructive. One more phenomenon must now be considered: the occurrence of what are termed crises. What are these crises? What is their real nature? The matter may be stated as follows. One fine day it appears that various commodities have been produced in excessive quantities. Prices fall, but the stock of goods cannot be cleared. The warehouses are filled with all kinds of products, for which there is no sale. Buyers are lacking. Needless to say, there are plenty of hungry workers, but they receive no more than a pittance, and cannot buy anything in excess of their usual purchases. Then calamity ensues. In some particular branch of industry, the small and middle-sized undertakings collapse first, and are closed down. Next comes the failure of the larger enterprises. But the branch of production thus affected bought commodities from another branch of production, this latter bought from a third. For instance, tailors buy cloth from the cloth makers, these buy wool from the yarn spinners, and so on. The tailors come to grief, and in consequence there are no customers for the cloth makers. Now the cloth makers fail, and their failure reacts upon the firms that supply them with wool and yarn. Factories and workshops everywhere close their doors, tens of thousands of workers are thrown on the streets, unemployment grows to unprecedented proportions, the worker's life becomes even worse. Yet there are plenty of commodities. The warehouses are bursting with them. This was continually happening before the war. Industry flourishes. The manufacturers' businesses work at high pressure. Suddenly there is a crash, followed by misery and unemployment, and business is at a standstill. After a time, recovery sets in. There comes a renewed period of excessive activity, to be followed in turn by a new collapse. The cycle is repeated over and over again. How can we explain this absurd state of affairs, wherein people become paupers in the midst of wealth? The question is not easy to answer. But we must answer it. We have already learned that in capitalist society there prevails a disorder, or so to say an anarchy, of production. Every factory owner, every entrepreneur, produces for himself, on his own responsibility, and at his own risk. The natural result in these circumstances is that sooner or later too many commodities are produced. There is overproduction. When there was production of goods but not of commodities, when, that is to say, production was not affected for the market, then there was no danger of overproduction. It is quite otherwise in the case of commodity production. Every manufacturer, in order that he may buy what he requires for further production, must first of all sell his own products. If in any particular place there is a stoppage of machinery on account of the anarchy of production, the trouble quickly spreads from one branch of production to another, so that a universal crisis ensues. These crises have a devastating influence. Large quantities of goods perish. The remnants of small-scale production are swept away as if by an iron broom. Even the big firms often fail. Most of the burden of these crises is of course borne by the working class. Some factories close down altogether, others reduce production, working only half-time, others are temporarily closed. The number of unemployed increases. The industrial reserve army grows larger. Simultaneously, there is an increase in the poverty and oppression of the working class. During these crises, the condition of the working class, bad at the best of times, grows even worse. Let us consider, for example, the data of the crisis of 1907-10, affecting both Europe and America, in fact the whole capitalist world. In the United States, the number of unemployed trade unionists increased as follows: June 1907, 8.1%, October, 18.5%, November, 22%, December, 32.7%, in the building trades, 42%, in the dressmaking trade, 43.6%, among tobacco workers, 55%. It goes without saying that the total number of unemployed, taking into account the unorganized workers as well, was still larger. In England, the percentage of unemployed in the summer of 1907 was 3.4 to 4%. In November, it rose to 5%. In December, to 6.1%. In June, 1908, it reached 8.2%. In Germany, during January 1908, the percentage of unemployed was twice as great as during the same month of the previous year. Like conditions were observable in other countries. As regards the falling off in production, it may be mentioned that in the United States the production of cast iron, which had been 26 million tons in 1907, was only 16 million tons in 1908. In times of crisis, the price of commodities falls. The capitalist magnates, eager to continue profit-making, do not hesitate to impair the quality of production. The coffee growers of Brazil dumped innumerable sacks of coffee into the sea in order to keep up prices. At the present time the whole world is suffering from hunger and from the non-production of goods, the result of the capitalist war. For these things are the offspring of capitalism, which decreed the disastrous war. In times of peace, capitalism was overwhelmed by a glut of products, which, however, did not advantage the workers. Their pockets were empty. The glut brought nothing to the workers except unemployment, with all its attendant evils. 17. The development of capitalism and of class. The intensification of the class struggle. We have seen that capitalist society is affected by two fundamental contradictions, two fundamental ills. In the first place, it is anarchistic, it lacks organization. In the second place, it is in fact composed of two mutually hostile societies, classes. We have also seen that, as capitalism develops, the anarchy of production, finding expression in competition, leads to ever-increasing strife, disorder, and ruin. The disintegration of society, far from diminishing, is actually increasing. Now all this arises from the splitting up of society into two portions, into classes. As capitalism develops, this severance, this cleavage between classes, likewise continues to increase. On one side, that of the capitalists, all the riches of the world are heaped up; on the other side, that of the oppressed classes, is an accumulation of misery, bitterness, and tears. The industrial reserve army gives birth to a stratum of debased and brutalized individuals, crushed to the earth by extreme poverty. But even those who remain at work are sharply distinguished from the capitalists by their manner of life. The differentiation of the proletariat from the bourgeoisie continually increases. Formerly there was quite a number of lesser capitalists, many of whom had close relationships with the workers and lived little better than these. Things are very different today. The lords of capital live in a manner of which no one dreamed in earlier days. It is true that the workers' standard of life has improved in the course of capitalist development. Down to the beginning of the 20th century, there occurred a general rise in wages. But during this same period, capitalist profits increased still more rapidly. Today there is a great gulf fixed between the toiling masses and the capitalist class. The capitalist now leads an entirely different sort of life. He himself produces nothing. The more capitalism develops, the more exalted becomes the position of the small group of extremely wealthy capitalists, and the wider grows the chasm between these uncrowned kings and the millions upon millions of enslaved proletarians. We have said that the wages of the workers have risen on the whole, but that profit has increased still more rapidly, and that for this reason the chasm between the two classes has widened. Since the beginning of the 20th century, however, wages have not risen but fallen, whereas during the same period profits have increased as never before. Hence there has during recent years been an exceptionally rapid increase in social inequality. It is perfectly clear that this social inequality, in its continued growth, must sooner or later lead to a clash between the workers and the capitalists. If the contrast between the two classes were diminishing, if the life conditions of the workers were becoming approximated to those of the capitalists, then, of course, we might look for a time of peace on earth and goodwill towards men. What actually occurs, however, is that in capitalist society the worker is day by day farther removed from the capitalist instead of drawing nearer to him. The inevitable result of this is a continuous accentuation of the class war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Bourgeois theorists put forward many objections to such a view. They would like to show that in capitalist society the condition of the working class undergoes continuous improvement. The socialists of the right wing sing the same tune. Writers of both these schools contend that the workers grow gradually richer, and can look forward to becoming petty capitalists themselves. Such expectations have been falsified. In actual fact, the condition of the workers as compared with that of the capitalists has persistently grown worse. Here is an example drawn from the United States, the land of most advanced capitalist development. If we consider the purchasing power of labor, that is to say, the quantity of necessaries which the workers can buy, taking the years from 1890 to 99 as a standard at 100, the purchasing power in various years was as follows: 1890, 98.6, 1895, 100.6, 1900, 103.0, 1905, 101.4, 1907, 101.5. This means that the worker's standard of life has undergone practically no improvement. The quantities of food, clothing, etc., bought by the average worker in 1890 was increased by no more than 3% in subsequent years. This was the utmost rise in the purchasing power of his wages. But during the same period the American millionaires, the industrial magnates, were making enormous profits, and the quantity of surplus value they were receiving was increasing to an immeasurable extent. As far as the capitalist standard of life, capitalist luxuries, and capitalist incomes are concerned, it is obvious that these were increased many times over. The class war arises out of the conflict of interests between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. These interests are as essentially irreconcilable as are the respective interests of wolves and sheep. It is plain that the capitalists will find it advantageous to make the workers work as long as possible and to pay them as little as possible. On the other hand, the workers will find it advantageous to work for the minimum hours and for the maximum wages. Obviously, therefore, since the time when the working class first began to exist, there must have been a struggle for higher wages and shorter hours. This struggle has never been interrupted, and has never been stilled. It has not, however, been restricted to a struggle for a trifling advance in wages. Wherever the capitalist system has developed, the toiling masses have become convinced that they must make an end of capitalism itself. The workers began to consider how this detested system could be replaced by a just and comradely system based upon work. Such was the origin of the communist movement of the working class. In their struggle, the workers have experienced numerous defeats. But the capitalist system bears within its womb the final victory of the proletariat. Why? For this reason, because the development of capitalism entails the proletarianization of the broad masses of the people. The victory of large-scale capital affects the ruin of independent artisans, small traders, and peasants. It swells the ranks of the wage workers. At each step in capitalist development, the proletariat grows more numerous. It is like the Hydra, the many-headed monster of fable. If you cut off one of its heads, 10 new ones grow. When the bourgeoisie suppressed a working class rising, it thereby strengthened the capitalist system. But the development of this capitalist system ruined petty proprietors and peasants by the million, throwing them under the feet of the capitalists. By this very process it increased the number of proletarians, the enemies of the capitalist class. But the increase in strength of the working class was not numerical merely. In addition, the working class became more strongly integrated. Why did this happen? Because, as capitalism developed, there was an increase in the number of great factories. Each great factory assembles within its walls 1,000 workers, sometimes as many as 10,000. These workers labor shoulder to shoulder. They recognize how their capitalist employer is exploiting them. They perceive that to each worker his fellow workers are friends and comrades. In the course of their work, the proletarians, united in the factory, learn how to unite forces. They more readily come to an agreement one with another. That is why, as capitalism develops, there is not merely an increase in the number of the workers, but an increase in working class solidarity. The faster, likewise, is the growth of gigantic cities with millions of inhabitants. Finally, in large towns, there is gathered together upon a comparatively restricted area an immense mass of persons, and the great majority of them belong to the factory proletariat. These masses are housed in foul and smoky quarters of the town, whilst the small group of the master class, the owners of all things, lives in luxurious mansions. The numbers of those constituting this small group are continually diminishing. The workers incessantly increase in numbers and their solidarity grows ever greater. Under such conditions, the inevitable increase in the intensity of the struggle cannot fail in the long run to lead to the victory of the working class. Sooner or later, notwithstanding all the wiles of the bourgeoisie, the workers will come into violent collision with the master class, will dethrone it, will destroy its robber government, and will create for themselves a new order, a communist order based on labor. In this manner, capitalism, by its own development, inevitably leads to the communist revolution of the proletariat. The class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie has assumed various forms. Three leading types of working class organization have arisen in the course of this struggle. First of all, we have the trade unions, grouping the workers according to occupation. Next come the cooperatives, which are mainly concerned with distribution, for it is their aim to free the workers from the grip of middlemen and traders. Last of all, we have the political parties of the working class, Socialist, Social Democrat, and Communist, whose program it is to guide the working class in its struggle for political power. The fiercer the struggle between the two classes became, the more essential was it that all sections of the working class movement should concentrate upon a single aim: the overthrow of the bourgeois state. Those leaders of the working class movement who have most perfectly realized the situation have always insisted upon the necessity for a close collaboration between all working class organizations. They pointed out, for example, the essential need for unity of action between the trade unions and the political parties of the proletariat, and they declared that the trade unions could not remain neutral, that is to say, indifferent in political matters. The unions, they said, must march shoulder to shoulder with the political parties of the working class. Quite recently, the workers' movement has assumed yet newer forms. The most important of these is the constitution of councils of workers' delegates, Soviets. We shall have to speak of these again and again in the course of the book. Thus, from our study of the development of the capitalist system, we can confidently deduce the following conclusions. The number of the capitalists grows smaller, but these few capitalists grow richer and stronger. The number of the workers continually increases, and working class solidarity likewise increases, though not to the same extent. The contrast between the workers and the capitalists grows ever greater. Inevitably, therefore, the development of capitalism leads to a clash between the two classes, that is, it leads to the communist revolution. 18. The concentration and centralization of capital as causal factors of communism. Capitalism, as we have seen, digs its own grave. For it creates its own grave-diggers, the proletarians. The more it develops, the more does it multiply those who are its mortal enemies, and the more does it unite them against itself. But it does not merely breed its enemies. It likewise prepares the ground for a new organization of social production, for a new economic order which will be comradely and communistic. How does it do this? We shall speedily give the answer. We have previously seen, glance at or reread 11 Capital, that capital is continually increasing in amount. The capitalist adds to his capital part of the surplus value which he extracts from the working class. By such means, capital grows larger. But if capital increases in amount, this implies that production must extend. The increase in capital, the growth of the amount held by one pair of hands, is termed the accumulation or concentration of capital. We have likewise seen, refer to 14. The struggle between large-scale and small-scale production, that the development of capitalism involves the decay of small-scale and medium-scale production, that the small and medium producers and traders are ruined, not to speak of the independent artisans. We have seen that the great capitalist gobbles them all up. The capital which was previously owned by the small and medium capitalists slips from their grasp, and by various routes finds its way into the maw of the big sharks. The capital owned by the great capitalists is consequently increased by the amount which they have wrested from the lesser capitalists. There is now an accumulation of capital in the hands of one individual, an accumulation of what had previously been distributed among various hands. Now, after the ruin of the lesser capitalists, their capital has become the spoil of the victors. This accumulation of capital which had previously been dispersed is spoken of as the centralization of capital. The concentration and centralization of capital, the accumulation of capital in a few hands, does not as yet imply the concentration and centralization of production. Let us suppose that a capitalist has used the accumulation of surplus value to buy a small factory from a neighbor, and that he keeps this factory running on the old lines. Here accumulation has taken place, but there is no change in production. Usually, however, things take a different course. In actual fact, it much more frequently happens that the capitalist, because it is profitable to him, remodels and extends production, that he enlarges his factories. This results, not merely in the expansion of capital, but in the expansion of production itself. Production is conducted on an enormous scale, utilizing vast quantities of machinery, and assembling many thousands of workers. It may happen that a dozen or so of huge factories will supply the demand of a whole country for a particular commodity. Essentially, what happens is that the workers are producing for the whole of society, that labor, as the phrase goes, has been socialized. But control and profit are still in the hands of the capitalist. Such a centralization and concentration of production actually paves the way for cooperative production after the proletarian revolution. Had this concentration of production not taken place, if the proletariat were to seize power at a time when the work of production was carried on in 100,000 tiny workshops each employing no more than 2 or 3 workers, it would be impossible to organize these workshops satisfactorily, to inaugurate social production. The further capitalism has developed, and the more highly centralized production has become, the easier will it be for the proletariat to manage production after the victory. Thus, capitalism does not merely create its own enemies and does not only lead to the communist revolution, but it brings into being the economic basis for the realization of the communist social order. Chapter 3: Communism and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. 19 Characteristics of the Communist System. Production under Communism. We have seen why the destruction of the capitalist system was inevitable. It is now perishing under our very eyes. It is perishing because it is affected by 2 fundamental contradictions: on the one hand, anarchy of production, leading to competition, crises, and wars; on the other hand, the class character of society, owing to which one part of society inevitably finds itself in mortal enmity with the other part, class war. Capitalist society is like a badly constructed machine, in which one part is continually interfering with the movements of another. See 13 Fundamental Contradictions of the Capitalist System. That is why it was inevitable that this machine would break down sooner or later. It is evident that the new society must be much more solidly constructed than capitalism. As soon as the fundamental contradictions of capitalism have destroyed the capitalist system, upon the ruins of that system there must arise a new society which will be free from the contradictions of the old. That is to say, the communist method of production must present the following characteristics. In the first place, it must be an organized society. It must be free from anarchy of production, from competition between individual entrepreneurs, from wars and crises. In the second place, it must be a classless society. Not a society in which the 2 halves are at eternal enmity one with the other. It must not be a society in which one class exploits the other. Now, a society in which there are no classes, and in which production is organized, can only be a society of comrades, a communist society based upon labor. Let us examine this society more closely. The basis of communist society must be the social ownership of the means of production and exchange. Machinery, locomotives, steamships, factory buildings, warehouses, grain elevators, mines, telegraphs and telephones, the land, sheep, horses, and cattle must all be at the disposal of society. All these means of production must be under the control of society as a whole, and not as at present under the control of individual capitalists or capitalist combines. What do we mean by society as a whole? We mean that ownership and control is not the privilege of a class but of all the persons who make up society. In these circumstances, society will be transformed into a huge working organization for cooperative production. There will then be neither disintegration of production nor anarchy of production. In such a social order, production will be organized. No longer will one enterprise compete with another. The factories, workshops, mines, and other productive institutions will all be subdivisions, as it were, of one vast people's workshop, which will embrace the entire national economy of production. It is obvious that so comprehensive an organization presupposes a general plan of production. If all the factories and workshops together with the whole of agricultural production are combined to form an immense cooperative enterprise, it is obvious that everything must be precisely calculated. We must know in advance how much labor to assign to the various branches of industry, what products are required and how much of each it is necessary to produce, how and where machines must be provided. These and similar details must be thought out beforehand, with approximate accuracy at least, and the work must be guided in conformity with our calculations. This is how the organization of communist production will be effected. Without a general plan, without a general directive system, and without careful calculation and bookkeeping, there can be no organization. But in the communist social order, there is such a plan. Mere organization does not, however, suffice. The essence of the matter lies in this, that the organization shall be a cooperative organization of all the members of society. The communist system, in addition to effecting organization, is further distinguished by the fact that it puts an end to exploitation, that it abolishes the division of society into classes. We might conceive the organization of production as being effected in the following manner. A small group of capitalists, a capitalist combine, controls everything. Production has been organized, so that capitalist no longer competes with capitalist. Conjointly they extract surplus value from the workers, who have been practically reduced to slavery. Here we have organization, but we also have the exploitation of one class by another. Here there is a joint ownership of the means of production, but it is joint ownership by one class, an exploiting class. This is something very different from communism, although it is characterized by the organization of production. Such an organization of society would have removed only one of the fundamental contradictions, the anarchy of production. But it would have strengthened the other fundamental contradiction of capitalism, the division of society into two warring halves. The class war would be intensified. Such a society would be organized along one line only. On another line, that of class structure, it would still be rent asunder. Communist society does not merely organize production, in addition, it frees people from oppression by others. It is organized throughout. The cooperative character of communist production is likewise displayed in every detail of organization. Under communism, for example, there will not be permanent managers of factories, nor will there be persons who do one and the same kind of work throughout their lives. Under capitalism, if a man is a bootmaker, he spends his whole life in making boots, the cobbler sticks to his last. If he is a pastry cook, he spends all his life baking cakes. If he is the manager of a factory, he spends his days in issuing orders and in administrative work. If he is a mere laborer, his whole life is spent in obeying orders. Nothing of this sort happens in communist society. Under communism, people receive a many-sided culture, and find themselves at home in various branches of production. Today I work in an administrative capacity. One reckon up how many felt boots or how many French rolls must be produced in the following month. Tomorrow I shall be working in a soap factory. next month perhaps in a steam laundry, and the month after in an electric power station. This will be possible when all the members of society have been suitably educated. 20. Distribution in the communist system. The communist method of production presupposes in addition that production is not for the market, but for use. Under communism, it is no longer the individual manufacturer or the individual peasant who produces. The work of production is effected by the gigantic cooperative as a whole. In consequence of this change, we no longer have commodities, but only products. These products are not exchanged one for another, they are either bought nor sold. They are simply stored in the communal warehouses, and are subsequently delivered to those who need them. In such conditions, money will no longer be required. How can that be, some of you will ask? In that case, one person will get too much and another too little. What sense is there in such a method of distribution? The answer is as follows. At first, doubtless, and perhaps for 20 or 30 years, it will be necessary to have various regulations. Maybe certain products will only be supplied to those persons who have a special entry in their workbook or on their work card. Subsequently, when communist society has been consolidated and fully developed, no such regulations will be needed. There will be an ample quantity of all products, our present wounds will long since have been healed, and everyone will be able to get just as much as he needs. But will not people find it to their interest to take more than they need? Certainly not. Today, for example, no one thinks it worthwhile when he wants one seat in a tram, to take 3 tickets and keep 2 places empty. It will be just the same in the case of all products. A person will take from the communal storehouse precisely as much as he needs, no more. No one will have any interest in taking more than he wants in order to sell the surplus to others, since all these others can satisfy their needs whenever they please. Money will then have no value. Our meaning is that at the outset, in the first days of communist society, products will probably be distributed in accordance with the amount of work done by the applicant. At a later stage, however, they will simply be supplied according to the needs of the comrades. It has often been contended that in the future society everyone will have the right to the full product of his labor. What you have made by your labor, that you will receive. This is false. It would never be possible to realize it fully. Why not? For this reason, that if everyone were to receive the full product of his labor, there would never be any possibility of developing, expanding, and improving production. Part of the work done must always be devoted to the development and improvement of production. If we had to consume and to use up everything we have produced, then we could never produce machines, for these cannot be eaten or worn. But it is obvious that the bettering of life will go hand in hand with the extension and improvement of machinery. It is plain that more and more machines must continually be produced. Now this implies that part of the labor which has been incorporated in the machines will not be returned to the person who has done the work. It implies that no one can ever receive the full product of his labor. But nothing of the kind is necessary. With the aid of good machinery, production will be so arranged that all needs will be satisfied. To sum up, at the outset products will be distributed in proportion to the work done, which does not mean that the worker will receive the full product of his labor. Subsequently, products will be distributed according to need, for there will be an abundance of everything. 21. Administration in the communist system. In a communist society there will be no classes. But if there will be no classes, this implies that in communist society there will likewise be no state. We have previously seen that the state is a class organization of the rulers. The state is always directed by one class against the other. A bourgeois state is directed against the proletariat, whereas a proletarian state is directed against the bourgeoisie. In the communist social order there are neither landlords, nor capitalists, nor wage workers, there are simply people comrades. If there are no classes, then there is no class war, and there are no class organizations. Consequently, the state has ceased to exist. Since there is no class war, the state has become superfluous. There is no one to be held in restraint, and there is no one to impose restraint. But how, they will ask us, can this vast organization be set in motion without any administration? Who is going to work out the plans for social production? Who will distribute labor power? Who is going to keep account of social income and expenditure? In a word, who is going to supervise the whole affair? It is not difficult to answer these questions. The main direction will be entrusted to various kinds of bookkeeping offices or statistical bureaus. There, from day to day, account will be kept of production and all its needs. There also it will be decided whither workers must be sent, whence they must be taken, and how much work there is to be done. And inasmuch as, from childhood onwards, all will have been accustomed to social labor, and since all will understand that this work is necessary, and that life goes easier when everything is done according to a prearranged plan and when the social order is like a well-oiled machine, all will work in accordance with the indications of these statistical bureaus. There will be no need for special ministers of state, for police and prisons, for laws and decrees, nothing of the sort. Just as in an orchestra all the performers watch the conductor's baton and act accordingly, so here all will consult the statistical reports, and will direct their work accordingly. The state, therefore, has ceased to exist. There are no groups and there is no class standing above all other classes. Moreover, in these statistical bureaus one person will work today, another tomorrow. The bureaucracy, the permanent officialdom, will disappear. The state will die out. Manifestly this will only happen in the fully developed and strongly established communist system, after the complete and definitive victory of the proletariat, nor will it follow immediately upon that victory. For a long time yet the working class will have to fight against all its enemies, and in especial against the relics of the past, such as sloth, slackness, criminality, pride. All these will have to be stamped out. 2 or 3 generations of persons will have to grow up under the new conditions before the need will pass for laws and punishments, and for the use of repressive measures by the worker state. Not until then will all the vestiges of the capitalist past disappear. Though in the intervening period the existence of the worker state is indispensable, subsequently, in the fully developed communist system, when the vestiges of capitalism are extinct, the proletarian state authority will also pass away. The proletariat itself will become mingled with all the other strata of the population, for everyone will by degrees come to participate in the common labor. Within a few decades there will be quite a new world, with new people and new customs. 22. The development of productive forces in the communist system, the advantages of communism. As soon as victory has been achieved and as soon as all our wounds have been healed, the communist system will rapidly develop the forces of production. This more rapid development of the forces of production will be due to the following causes. In the first place, there will have ensued the liberation of the vast quantity of human energy which is now absorbed in the class struggle. Just think how great is the waste of nervous energy, strength, and labor upon the political struggle, upon strikes, revolts and their suppression, trials in the law courts, police activities, the state authority, upon the daily effort of the two hostile classes. The class war now swallows up vast quantities of energy and material means. In the new system this energy will be liberated. People will no longer struggle one with another. The liberated energy will be devoted to the work of production. Secondly, the energy and the material means which now are destroyed or wasted in competition, crises, and wars, will all be saved. If we consider how much is squandered upon wars alone, we shall realize that this amounts to an enormous quantity. How much, again, is lost to society through the struggle of sellers one with another, of buyers one with another, and of sellers with buyers? How much futile destruction results from commercial crises? How much needless outlay results from the disorganization and confusion that prevail in production? All these energies, which now run to waste, will be saved in communist society. Thirdly, the organization of industry on a purposive plan will not merely save us from needless waste, in so far as large-scale production is always more economical. In addition, it will be possible to improve production from the technical side, for work will be conducted in very large factories and with the aid of perfected machinery. Under capitalism, there are definite limits to the introduction of new machinery. The capitalist only introduces new machinery when he cannot procure a sufficiency of cheap labor. If he can hire an abundance of cheap labor, the capitalist will never install new machinery, since he can secure ample profit without this trouble. The capitalist finds machinery requisite only when it reduces his expenses for highly paid labor. Under capitalism, however, labor is usually cheap. The bad conditions that prevail among the working class become a hindrance to the improvement of manufacturing technique. This causal sequence is peculiarly obvious in agriculture. Here labor power has always been cheap, and for that reason, the introduction of machinery in agricultural work has been extremely slow. In communist society, our concern will not be for profit but for the workers. There every technical advance will be immediately adopted. The chains which capitalism imposed will no longer exist. Technical advances will continue to take place under communism, for all will now enjoy a good education, and those who under capitalism perished from want mentally gifted workers, for instance, will be able to turn their capacities to full account. In communist society, parasitism will likewise disappear. There will be no place for the parasites who do nothing and who live at others' cost. That which in capitalist society is squandered by the capitalists in gluttony, drunkenness, and riotous living, will in communist society be devoted to the needs of production. The capitalists, their lackeys, and their hangers-on, priests, prostitutes, and the rest, will disappear, and all the members of society will be occupied in productive labor. The communist method of production will signify an enormous development of productive forces. As a result, no worker in communist society will have to do as much work as of old. The working day will grow continually shorter, and people will be to an increasing extent freed from the chains imposed on them by nature. As soon as man is enabled to spend less time upon feeding and clothing himself, he will be able to devote more time to the work of mental development. Human culture will climb to heights never attained before. It will no longer be a class culture, but will become a genuinely human culture. Concurrently with the disappearance of man's tyranny over man, the tyranny of nature over man will likewise vanish. Men and women will for the first time be able to lead a life worthy of thinking beings instead of a life worthy of brute beasts. The opponents of communism have always described it as a process of sharing things out equally. They declared that the communists wanted to confiscate everything and to divide everything up, to parcel out the land, to divide up the other means of production, and to share out also all the articles of consumption. Nothing could be more absurd than this notion. Above all, such a general division is impossible. We could share out land, horses and cattle, money, but could not share out railways, machinery, steamboats, and various other things of the sort. So much for that. Furthermore, such a division, as far as practicable, would not merely do no good to anyone, but would be a backward step for mankind. It would create a vast number of petty proprietors. But we have already seen that out of petty proprietorship and the competition among petty proprietors there issues large-scale proprietorship. Thus, even if it were possible to realize such an equal division, the same old cycle would be reproduced. Proletarian communism, or proletarian socialism, is a huge cooperative commonwealth. It is a sequence of the whole development of capitalist society and of the condition of the proletariat in that society. It must be carefully distinguished from the four following things. 1. Lumpen proletarian socialism, anarchism. The anarchists reproach the communists on the ground that communism, so they contend, will maintain the state authority in the future society. As we have seen, the assertion is false. The essential difference consists in this, that the anarchists are far more concerned with dividing up than with the organization of production, and that they conceive the organization of production as taking the form, not of a huge cooperative commonwealth, but of a great number of free, small, self-governing communes. It need hardly be said that such a social system would fail to liberate mankind from nature's yoke, for in it the forces of production would not be developed even to the degree to which they have been developed under capitalism. Anarchism would not increase production, but would disintegrate it. It is natural that, in practice, the anarchists should advocate the dividing up of articles of consumption and should oppose the organization of large-scale production. They do not, for the most part, represent the interests and aspirations of the working class. They represent those of what is termed the lumpenproletariat, the loafer proletariat. They represent the interests of those who live in bad conditions under capitalism, but who are quite incapable of independent creative work. 2. Petty bourgeois socialism. This finds its main supporters, not in the proletariat, but in the decaying class of independent artisans, among the lower middle-class townsfolk, and in part among the intelligentsia, professional classes. It protests against large-scale capital, but it does so in the name of the freedom of petty enterprise. For the most part, the petty bourgeois socialists advocate bourgeois democracy and oppose the social revolution. They hope to attain their ideals peacefully through the development of cooperatives, a unified organization of home workers, and so on. In Russia, most of the urban cooperatives formed by the social revolutionists exhibit this complexion. Under capitalism, cooperative enterprises are apt to degenerate into ordinary capitalistic organizations, and the cooperators can in this case hardly be distinguished from bourgeois. 3. Agrarian peasant socialism. This assumes various forms, and at times closely resembles peasant anarchism. Its most distinctive characteristic is the way in which it habitually fails to look upon socialism as a system of large-scale production, and the way in which it inclines towards dividing up and towards equalization. Its main distinction from anarchism is that it demands the creation of a strong central authority which shall protect it on the one hand from the landlords and on the other from the proletariat. In this form of socialism we have the socialization of the land advocated by the social revolutionists, who desire to establish small-scale production in perpetuity, who dread the proletariat, and who oppose the formation of a great and united cooperative commonwealth. In addition, among certain strata of the peasantry, we find yet other varieties of socialism more or less akin to anarchism. Here the state authority is repudiated, but the advocates of these trends are distinguished by their pacifist views, various communistically inclined sectaries, such as the Dehobers, etc. The agrarian types of socialism will not be eradicated until after the lapse of a good many years. They will disappear as soon as the masses of the peasantry come to realize the advantages of large-scale production. We shall return to this matter later in the book. 4. Slaveholding and large-scale capitalistic socialism, so-called. In this form we cannot discern so much as a trace of socialism. In the three varieties previously mentioned, we find at least some tincture of socialism, and we find in them a protest against oppression. But in the fourth variety, the one we are now considering, the socialism is a mere word, fraudulently employed by those who want a new shuffle of the cards. This variety was introduced by bourgeois intellectuals and was taken over from them by the socialist advocates of class collaboration, and in part by Kautsky and Company. Of such a character, for example, was the Communism of Plato, the philosopher of ancient Greece. The essential characteristic of his system was that the slaveholders' organization would in comradely fashion and jointly exploit the mass of slaves who were to have no legal rights. As far as the slave owners were concerned, there would be perfect equality, and all things would be held in common. The case of the slaves was to be very different. They were to become mere cattle. Obviously, this has nothing whatever to do with socialism. A similar sort of socialism has been advocated by certain bourgeois professors under the name of state socialism. The only difference from Plato's variety is that contemporary proletarians have taken the place of the slaves, while the capitalist magnates sit in the seats of the mighty in place of the slave owners. Here, likewise, there is no trace of socialism. We have state capitalism, based upon forced labor. To this matter we shall return. Petty bourgeois, agrarian, and lumpenproletarian socialism have one characteristic common to them all. Such varieties of non-proletarian socialism are outside the general course of evolution. the course of social evolution leads to the expansion of production. But in these non-proletarian varieties, the whole trend is towards small-scale production. Inevitably, therefore, socialism of this kind is nothing more than a utopian dream. There is no likelihood of its actual realization. 23. The dictatorship of the proletariat. For the realization of the communist system, the proletariat must have all authority and all power in its hands. The proletariat cannot overthrow the old world unless it has power in its hands, unless for a time it becomes the ruling class. Manifestly, the bourgeoisie will not abandon its position without a fight. For the bourgeoisie, communism signifies the loss of its former power, the loss of its freedom to extort blood and sweat from the workers, the loss of its right to rent, interest, and profit. Consequently, the communist revolution of the proletariat, the communist transformation of society, is fiercely resisted by the exploiters. It follows that the principal task of the workers' government is to crush this opposition ruthlessly. Precisely because the opposition will inevitably be so embittered, it is necessary that the workers' authority, the proletarian rule, shall take the form of a dictatorship. Now, dictatorship signifies very strict methods of government, and a resolute crushing of enemies. It is obvious that in such a state of affairs there can be no talk of freedom for everyone. The dictatorship of the proletariat is incompatible with freedom for the bourgeoisie. This is the very reason why the dictatorship of the proletariat is needed, to deprive the bourgeoisie of freedom, to bind it hand and foot, to make it impossible for it to carry on a struggle against the revolutionary proletariat. The more vigorous the resistance of the bourgeoisie, the more desperate the mobilization of its forces, the more threatening its attitude, the sterner and harsher must be the proletarian dictatorship. In extreme cases, the workers' government must not hesitate to use the method of the terror. Only when the suppression of the exploiters is complete, when they have ceased to resist, when it is no longer in their power to injure the working class, will the proletarian dictatorship grow progressively milder. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie, little by little, will fuse with the proletariat, the worker state will gradually die out, society as a whole will be transformed into a communist society in which there will be no classes. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, a temporary institution, the means of production will from the nature of the case belong, not to society as a whole, but only to the proletariat, to its state organization. For the time being, the working class, that is the majority of the population, monopolizes the means of production. Consequently, there does not yet exist communist production in all its completeness. There still exists the division of society into classes. There is still a governing class, the proletariat. All the means of production are monopolized by this new governing class. There is still a state authority, the proletarian authority, which crushes its enemies. But as the resistance of the sometime capitalists, landlords, bankers, generals, and bishops is crushed, in like measure the system of proletarian dictatorship will without any revolution undergo transformation into communism. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not only an instrument for the crushing of enemies, it is likewise a lever for effecting economic transformation. Private ownership of the means of production must be replaced by social ownership. The bourgeoisie must be deprived of the means of production and exchange, must be expropriated. Who will and can do this? Obviously, no isolated individual could do it, even if he should be of proletarian origin. If it were to be done by an isolated individual, or even by isolated groups of individuals, at the best it would be nothing more than a dividing up, and at the worst it would be a mere act of robbery. We understand, therefore, why the expropriation of the bourgeoisie must be effected by the organized power of the proletariat. Now this organized power takes the form of the dictatorial worker state. Objections to the dictatorship of the proletariat arise from various quarters. First of all come the anarchists. They say that they are in revolt against all authority and against every kind of state, whereas the communist Bolsheviks are the sustainers of the Soviet government. Every kind of government, they continue, involves the abuse of power and the limitation of freedom. For this reason it is necessary to overthrow the Bolsheviks, the Soviet government, the dictatorship of the proletariat. No dictatorship is necessary, no state is necessary. Such are the arguments of the anarchists. Only in appearance is their criticism revolutionary. In actual fact, the anarchists do not stand more to the left, but more to the right than the Bolsheviks. Why, indeed, do we need the dictatorship? We need it for the organized destruction of the bourgeois a copyright game. We need it that we may crush the enemies of the proletariat by force. Quite openly we say by force. The dictatorship is the axe in the hands of the proletariat. Anyone who is opposed to the dictatorship of the proletariat is one who is afraid of decisive action, is afraid of hurting the bourgeoisie, is no revolutionist. When we have completely vanquished the bourgeoisie, the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat will no longer exist. But as long as the life and death struggle continues, it is absolutely incumbent upon the working class to crush its enemies utterly. An epoch of proletarian dictatorship must inevitably intervene between a capitalist and a communist society. Next, as objectors to the dictatorship, come the social democrats, and in especial the Mensheviks. These worthies have completely forgotten what they wrote about the matter in former days. In our old program, drawn up by ourselves and the Mensheviks together, it is expressly stated, an essential condition of the social revolution is the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is to say, the conquest of political power by the proletariat, which will enable the workers to crush all resistance on the part of the exploiters. The Mensheviks signed this statement. But when the time came for action, they raised a clamor against the crushing of the freedom of the bourgeoisie, against the suppression of bourgeois newspapers, against the Bolshevist reign of terror, and so on. Even Plekhanov, at one time, thoroughly approved of the most ruthless measures against the bourgeoisie, saying that we could deprive the bourgeois of their electoral rights, and so on. Nowadays the Mensheviks have forgotten all this. They have taken refuge in the camp of the bourgeoisie. Finally, a number of moral considerations are brought into the argument against us. We are told that we form our judgments like the savage Hottentots. The Hottentot says, "When I steal my neighbor's wife, it is good; when he steals my wife, it is bad." The Bolsheviks, it is contended, resemble these savages, for they say, "When the bourgeoisie uses force to crush the proletariat, it is bad; but when the proletariat uses force to crush the bourgeoisie, it is good." Those who argue thus do not know what they are talking about. In the case of the Hottentots, we are concerned with two equal individuals who are stealing one another's wives for identical reasons. But the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are not on equal terms. Proletarians comprise an enormous class, bourgeois form a comparatively small group. The proletariat is fighting for the liberation of all mankind, but the bourgeoisie is fighting for the maintenance of oppression, wars, exploitation. The proletariat is fighting for communism, the bourgeoisie for the preservation of capitalism. If capitalism and communism were one and the same thing, then the bourgeoisie and the proletariat could be compared to the two Hottentots. The proletariat is fighting solely on behalf of the new social order. Whatever helps in the struggle is good, whatever hinders is bad. 24. The conquest of political power. The proletariat makes its dictatorship actual through the conquest of the state power. But what do we mean by the conquest of power? Many persons imagine that it is quite an easy matter to wrest power from the bourgeoisie, as easy as to transfer a ball from one pocket to another. First, power is in the hands of the bourgeoisie, then the proletariat will drive the bourgeoisie from power and will take the reins into its own hands. According to this view, the problem is not the creation of a new power, but the seizure of a power that already exists. Such a notion is utterly false, and a very little reflection will show us where the error lies. The state power is an organization. The bourgeois state power is a bourgeois organization, and in that organization people are assigned their roles in a distinctive manner. At the head of the army are generals, members of the wealthy class. At the head of the administration are ministers, members of the wealthy class, and so on. When the proletariat is fighting for power, against whom and what is it fighting? In the first place, against this bourgeois organization. Now, when it is fighting this organization, its task is to deliver blows that will destroy the organization. But since the main strength of the government resides in the army, if we wish to gain the victory over the bourgeoisie, the first essential is to disorganize and destroy the bourgeois army. The German communists could not overthrow the RA copyright Geim of Scheidman and Noski unless they could destroy the army of White Guards. If the opposing army remain intact, the victory of the revolution will be impossible. If the revolution be victorious, the army of the bourgeoisie will disintegrate and crumble. This, for example, is why the victory over Tsarism signified no more than a partial destruction of the Tsarist state and a partial decomposition of the army. But the victory of the November Revolution denoted the final overthrow of the state organization of the provisional government and the total dissolution of the Kerenskyite army. Thus the revolution destroys the old power and creates a new one, a different power from that which existed before. Of course, the new power takes over some of the constituent parts of the old, but it uses them in a different way. It follows that the conquest of state power is not the conquest of the pre-existent organization, but the creation of a new organization, an organization brought into being by the class which has been victorious in the struggle. The practical importance of this question is enormous. The German Bolsheviks, for example, have been reproached, as the Russian Bolsheviks were formerly reproached, on the ground that they have led to disintegration in the army and have promoted indiscipline, have encouraged disobedience to officers. This used to be considered, and by many is still considered, a terrible charge. But there is nothing terrible about it. We must promote disintegration in an army which is ranged against the workers and is at the orders of the bourgeoisie, even though the latter consists of our fellow countrymen. Failing this, the revolution will succumb. Consequently, there is nothing to be afraid of in working for the disintegration of such a bourgeois army. A revolutionist who destroys the state apparatus of the bourgeoisie may consider that he is doing excellent service. Where bourgeois discipline remains intact, the bourgeoisie is invincible. Those who wish to overthrow the bourgeoisie must not shrink from hurting it. 25. The Communist Party and the classes of capitalist society. In order that the proletariat may gain the victory in any country, it is essential that it should be compact and well organized. It is essential that it should have its own Communist Party which has clearly recognized the trend of capitalist development, which has understood the actual situation and the true interests of the working class, which has adequately interpreted that situation, which is competent to marshal the ranks and to conduct the battle. Nowhere and at no time has any part been able to enroll all the members of the class which it represents. Never has any class attained the requisite degree of consciousness. Generally speaking, those who organize themselves into a party are the most advanced members of a class, those who best understand their class interests, those who are most daring, most energetic, and most stubborn in the fight. For this reason, the number of adherents of the party is always considerably less than the number of those composing the class whose interests the party represents. Since, however, a party definitely represents the rightly interpreted interests of the class, parties usually play a leading role. The party leads the whole class, and the struggle between classes for power finds expression in the struggle between political parties for power. He who wishes to understand the nature of political parties must study the relationships of the various classes in capitalist society. Out of these relationships, definite class interests arise. As we have already learned, the defense of class interests is the essential purpose of political parties. Landowners. During the first period of capitalist development, agrarian economy was based upon the semi-slave labor of the peasants. The landowners leased lands to the peasants, receiving as rent payment either in money or in kind. One method of payment in kind was for the worker to spend half his time tilling the landowner's estate. The landowners as a class found it to their interest to prevent the peasants from going to the towns. They therefore resisted all innovation. They desired to maintain the old semi-slave conditions in the villages. They opposed the development of manufacturing industry. Such landowners possessed ancient patrimonial seigneurial domains. Very few of them did any work on their own estates, and they lived for the most part like parasites on the backs of the peasants. As a result of this state of affairs, the parties representing the landowners have always been and still are the main props of reaction. These are the political parties that everywhere desire a return to the old order. They want to go back to the rule of the landlords, to restore the landlord czar, the monarch, to ensure the predominance of the blue-blooded gentry, to effect the complete enslavement of the peasants and the workers. They form what are known as the conservative parties. It would be more accurate to term them the reactionary parties. Since from time immemorial the officers of the army and the navy have been drawn from the ranks of the landed gentry, it is perfectly natural that landowners' parties should always be on the best of terms with generals and admirals. This is what we find in every country throughout the world. As an example may be mentioned the members of the Prussian Junker caste. In Germany, the great landowners are known as junkets, who send some of their sons into the officers' corps. Similarly in Russia we have our landed gentry, the so-called backwoods men, the Oroxes, like some of the deputies to the Duma Markov II, Krupensky, and others. The Tsarist Council of State was largely composed of members of this landlord class. Most of the wealthy landowners belonging to old families bear such titles as prince, count, etc. They are the true descendants of ancestors who owned thousands of bond slaves. The landlords' parties in Russia were the League of the Russian People, the Nationalist Party, led by Krupensky, the Right Octobrists, etc. The capitalist bourgeoisie. The interest of this class is to secure the greatest possible profits out of the developing national industry, that is to say, out of surplus value extracted from the working class. Manifestly, this interest does not fully coincide with that of the landowners. When capital makes its influence felt in village life, the old conditions are disturbed. The peasants are attracted into the towns, capital creates a vast proletariat, and it arouses new needs in the villages. The peasants, hitherto docile and quiet, grow unruly. The landowners, the backwoodsmen, find these innovations unpleasing. On the other hand, the capitalist bourgeoisie regards them as full of promise. The more the workers are lured from the villages to the towns, the more wage labor, consequently, is available for the service of the capitalist, and the cheaper can the capitalist hire it. The more completely village life is ruined and the greater the extent to which the petty producers cease to produce various articles for themselves, the more essential do they find it to buy these products from the large-scale manufacturers. The more rapid, therefore, the disappearance of the old conditions in which the village produced everything for itself, the greater will be the expansion of the market for the sale of factory-produced commodities, and the higher will be the profits of the capitalist class. For this reason the capitalist class rails at landlords of the old school. There are, in addition, capitalist landlords. These run their estates with the help of wage labor and with the aid of machinery. Their interests are closely akin to those of the bourgeoisie, and they usually adhere to the parties of the wealthier capitalists. But of course the chief struggle of the capitalists is with the working class. When the working class is fighting mainly against the landlords and very little against the bourgeoisie, the latter eyes approvingly the struggle of the working class. This was the case in the year 1904, and in 1905 until October. But when the workers begin to realize their communist interests, and to march against the bourgeoisie, then the bourgeoisie joins forces with the landlords against the workers. Everywhere, today, the parties of the capitalist bourgeoisie, the so-called liberal parties, are carrying on a fierce struggle against the revolutionary proletariat, and it is they who form the political general staff of the counter-revolution. Among such parties in Russia, two may be mentioned. First of all we have the Party of Popular Freedom, also known as the Party of Constitutional Democrats. From the initials of its name, CD, its members are generally spoken of as the cadets. Secondly there are the Octobrists, who have now almost disappeared. Members of the industrial bourgeoisie, capitalist landlords, bankers, and the champions of all these, the major intelligentsia, university professors, successful lawyers and authors, factory managers, etc., form the nuclei of these parties. In the year 1905 the cadets were murmuring against the autocracy, but they were already afraid of the workers and the peasants. After the Revolution of March 1917, they became the leaders of all the forces that were marshaled against the party of the working class, against the Communist Bolsheviks. In the years 1918 and 1919, the cadets took the lead in all the plots against the Soviet government, and they participated in the administrations of General Denikin and Admiral Kolchak. In a word, they led the bloody reaction, and finally they even formed a coalition with the landowners' parties. For under the pressure of the working class movement, all groups of wealthy proprietors unite in a single camp of reactionaries, led by the most energetic section among them, the urban petty bourgeoisie. To this group belong the independent artisans, the small shopkeepers, the minor intelligentsia comprising the salariat, and the lesser officialdom. In reality, they do not constitute a class, but a motley crowd. All these elements are exploited more or less by capital, and they are often overworked. Many of them are ruined in the course of capitalist development. The conditions of their work, however, are such that for the most part they fail to realize how hopeless is their situation under capitalism. Let us consider, for instance, the independent artisan. He is as industrious as an ant. Capital exploits him in various ways. The usurer exploits him, the shop for which he works exploits him, and so on. The artisan feels himself to be a master. He works with his own tools, and in appearance he is independent, although in reality he is completely entangled in the web of the capitalist spider. He lives in the perennial hope of bettering himself, thinking always, I shall soon be able to extend my business, then I shall buy for myself. He is careful not to mix with the workers, and in his manners he avoids imitating them, affecting the manners of the gentry, for he always hopes to become a gentleman himself. Consequently, although he is as poor as a church mouse, he usually feels more akin to the man who exploits him than he does to the workers. The petty bourgeois parties commonly assemble under the standard of the radicals or the republicans, but sometimes under that of the socialists. Refer to the small type paragraphs of 22. It is extremely difficult to shake such people out of this wrong attitude of mind, which is their misfortune, not their fault. In Russia, more commonly than elsewhere, the petty bourgeois parties have been apt to wear a socialist mask. This was done by the populist socialists, the social revolutionaries, and in part by the Mensheviks. It is necessary to point out that the social revolutionaries tended to rely mainly upon the middle peasants and the rich peasants for support. The peasantry. In the rural districts, the peasantry occupies a position closely akin to that occupied by the petty bourgeoisie in the towns. It too, properly speaking, does not constitute a single class, for under capitalism it is continually splitting up into classes. In every village and hamlet we find that some of the peasants go to look for work in the towns, and thus in time become completely transformed into proletarians. Others develop into wealthy and usurious peasants. The middle peasants form an unstable stratum. Many of them are ruined in course of time. They become horseless men, and eventually seek work as agricultural laborers or as factory hands. Others are more successful, get on in the world, gather wealth, become master peasants, hire agricultural laborers, make use of machinery. In a word, they are transformed into capitalist entrepreneurs. That is why we are entitled to say that the peasantry does not, properly speaking, form a single class. Among the peasants we must distinguish at least three groups. First we have the rich peasants, the master peasants, who constitute a rural bourgeoisie, for they are exploiters of wage labor. Next come the middle peasants, who work their own little farms and do not exploit wage labor. Thirdly and lastly, we have the poor peasants forming the rural semi-proletariat and proletariat. It is easy to understand that the members of these respective groups, owing to the difference in their positions, will take different views of the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The rich peasants are as a rule allied with the bourgeoisie, and very often with the great landlords as well. In Germany, for example, those who are termed great peasants are united in a single organization with the priests and the landlords. We find the same thing in Switzerland and in Austria, and to some extent also in France. In Russia, during the year 1918, the rich peasants supported all the counter-revolutionary plots. Those belonging to the semi-proletarian and proletarian strata naturally backed the workers in their struggle with the bourgeoisie and the rich peasants. As far as the middle peasants are concerned, the matter is much more complicated. If the middle peasants would only realize that for the majority among them there is no way out under capitalism, that only a few of them can ever hope to become rich peasants, whereas most of them are fated to live in penury, then they would be ready to give unstinted support to the workers. But their misfortune lies in this, that the same thing happens to them as happens in the towns to the independent artisans and the members of the petty bourgeoisie. Every one of them, at the bottom of his heart, cherishes the hope of getting on, of growing rich. But on the other hand, the middle peasant is oppressed by the capitalist, the money-lender, the landlord, and the rich peasant. The result is, as a rule, that the middle peasant seesaws between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He is unable wholeheartedly to adopt the working class platform, but at the same time he is terribly afraid of the landowner. This wobbling has been peculiarly plain in Russia. The middle peasants supported the workers against the landlords and the rich peasants. Then, growing afraid lest they should not be so well off in the commune, they listened to the advice of the rich peasants and opposed the workers. Still later, when danger threatened from the side of the landowning class, Denikin, Kolchak, they were once more inclined to espouse the cause of the workers. The same vacillation has been displayed in the party struggle. At one time the middle peasants would adhere to the party of the workers, the party of the communist Bolsheviks. At another time they would adhere to the party of the rich peasants, the party of the Essers, social revolutionaries. The working class, the proletariat. This class consists of those who have nothing to lose but their chains. Not only are they exploited by the capitalists, but in addition, as we have already learned, the very course of capitalist development leads to their solidarization into a homogeneous power, consisting of persons accustomed to work together and to fight together. For this reason, the working class is the most progressive class in capitalist society. For this reason, likewise, the party of the working class is the most progressive, the most revolutionary party that can possibly exist. It is natural, moreover, that the aim of this party should be to bring about the communist revolution. To this end, the proletarian party must be absolutely uncompromising. Its function is not to chaffer with the bourgeoisie, but to hurl the bourgeoisie from power and to crush the resistance of the capitalists. This party must reveal the absolute conflict of interests as between exploiters and exploited. The words were used in our old program, which was signed by the Mensheviks. But alas, the Mensheviks have quite forgotten them, and are now hand in glove with the bourgeoisie. What, however, should be the attitude of our party towards the petty bourgeoisie, towards the non-proletarian poor strata of our large towns, and towards the middle peasants? This is clear from what has been said above. We must never weary in our proofs and explanations, in order to convince them that their hopes for a better life under capitalism are the outcome of fraud by others or are due to their own self-deception. We must patiently and clearly demonstrate to the middle peasants that they ought unhesitatingly to enter the proletarian camp, and despite all difficulties fight shoulder to shoulder with the workers. It is our duty to show them that the only peasants to gain by the victory of the bourgeoisie will be the rich peasants, who will in that case become transformed into a new landlord class. In a word, we must bring all those who work to make common cause with the proletariat, must enable all those who work to see things from the working class point of view. Those who belong to the petty bourgeoisie and to the stratum of the middle peasants are full of prejudices arising out of the conditions of their lives. It is our duty to reveal the true posture of affairs. We must show that the position of the artisan and of the working peasant under capitalism is quite hopeless, and that they had better give up trying to amuse themselves with fancy pictures. We must tell the middle peasant that as long as capitalism lasts there will always be a landlord riding on his back, either one of the gentry, the old type of landlord, or else a rich peasant, the landlord of the new type. In no other way than through the victory and the strengthening of the proletariat is there any possibility of rebuilding life on new foundations. But since the victory of the proletariat can only be secured through the organization of the workers and through the existence of a strong, solid, and resolute party, we must draw into our ranks all those who labor, all those to whom the new life is dear, all those who have learned to think and to fight like proletarians. How important the existence of a solid and militant Communist Party is, can be learned from the examples of Germany and Russia. In Germany, where the proletariat is highly developed, there was nevertheless prior to the war no such militant party of the working class as that of the Communist Bolsheviks in Russia. Only during the war did comrades Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, and others begin to found a distinctively communist party. This is why, during the years 1918 and 1919, notwithstanding a number of risings, the German workers proved unable to overthrow the bourgeoisie. In Russia, however, there existed our uncompromisingly communist party. Thanks to this, the Russian proletariat was well led. Hence, despite all difficulties, the Russian proletariat was the first to secure a solid and speedy victory. In this respect, our party may and does serve as an example to other communist parties. Its solidity and discipline are universally recognized. It is, in fact, the most militant party of the proletarian revolution, and as such it occupies the leading place.